right, it's 1 o'clock, so it's time to get started. I have just a little bit left to cover before we finish up chapter 20, and then I'll entertain questions if anybody has any questions over the review questions, okay? So this second exam is going to be over nothing but the heart and blood pressure. Okay? Heart, blood vessels, and blood pressure. So it's all kind of related. So that'll be kind of nice. It's kind of one little compact unit. Okay. So we'll talk about some things maybe to emphasize on your studying too when we get done today. So the next topic in chapter 20 has to do with mechanisms that aid in venous return. Okay. Now, veins are called the capacitance vessels because they can expand to accommodate more blood. And that does happen because the blood in the veins isn't under very high pressure. Because of the resistance of the capillaries after blood goes through the capillary beds, the blood isn't under much pressure anymore. And so gravity can actually pull blood downward in the lower part of our body, and it can pool in our veins. And so our body has three different mechanisms to help push that blood back up to the heart, because it's important that that venous blood returns to the heart, because if it doesn't, the heart isn't going to pump anything. Okay, the blood has to have, or the heart has to have something to pump. If it doesn't return to the heart, then cardiac output is going to go down. Actually, stroke volume is going to go down, which in turn affects cardiac output. Cardiac output, since that's one of the two factors that affects blood pressure, it'll cause blood pressure to fall. So sometimes people will actually faint because they're standing, like standing at attention for long periods of time. Gravity will pull blood down into their legs, and venous return to the heart decreases. And because of Starling's law of the heart pumps whatever blood it receives. If you don't get much blood return to the heart, it's not going to pump much. And so cardiac output's going to go down, and blood pressure is going to go down. Okay? So there are three different mechanisms that help to return blood back to the heart to ensure there's enough end diastolic volume that the heart can pump with enough force to maintain cardiac output. Okay? And these factors are also one of the reasons why cardiac output increases during exercise, because exercise will actually increase the activity of these three mechanisms. So the first one is called the skeletal muscle pump. This mechanism arises because of the location of the veins relative to the large muscles in your legs. Most of the veins in your legs are located between large muscle masses. And when muscles contract, they get shorter, but most importantly, in this case, they also get thicker. The belly of the muscle expands, and that squeezes the veins between these large blood vessels. And when it squeezes the veins, there's only two ways for the blood to go. It can either go up or it can go down, right? Because that's the direction the blood vessels traveling, is up and down. However, there are valves in the medium-sized veins. And so when the blood goes down, that pressure on the valves causes them to close. So the blood can't go downward very far. So the only other direction the blood can go is up. So the blood can push through the valves, and it can move up towards the heart. So the contraction of your leg muscles actually helps to pump or push blood back up to your heart. Okay? That's why sometimes when soldiers are standing at attention for long periods of time, if they don't know that to contract their leg muscles while they're doing that, sometimes they'll faint because gravity will pull that blood down in their legs and venous return will decrease, and so that will cause stroke volume to decrease. Stroke volume is one of the factors that affects cardiac output. Cardiac output decreases. Since cardiac output is one of the factors that affects mean arterial pressure, that causes blood pressure to drop. If it drops too far, it can cause a person to faint. Okay. So that's the first mechanism, the skeletal muscle pump. Second one is called the thoracic or respiratory pump. This happens as a result of breathing. So during inspiration or inhalation, your diaphragm ordinarily is a dome-shaped muscle when it's relaxed. And during inspiration, your phrenic nerves cause your diaphragm to contract, and it flattens out and it moves downward. That expands the volume of your thoracic cavity. In addition, your external intercostal muscles, which are attached to the top of your ribs, those also contract. That helps to elevate your rib cage. So your rib cage is elevated, the diaphragm drops down. That increases the volume of your thoracic cavity. Whenever you have an increase in volume of a closed space, that's going to cause the pressure to drop. So when the pressure drops in your thoracic cavity, that helps to draw blood up from the lower part of your body. Okay? If the pressure in your thoracic cavity drops below the pressure in your abdomen, then blood is going to be pulled upward. It's going to flow upward, back towards the heart. So that also is another mechanism that helps to increase venous return to the heart. Okay? So the moral of the story is, you don't want to stand still for long periods of time without contracting your leg muscles and without breathing. Because if you don't breathe, this thoracic, this respiratory pump is not going to work. And if your leg muscles don't contract, then you're not going to get the benefit of that skeletal muscle pump. Okay. Now, this is also related to another phenomenon that occurs sometimes. Sometimes occurs in people that are constipated. If a person is constipated and they have really hard fecal material, it's hard for them to push out those feces during defecation. And you really have to work hard to do that. To do that, you have to increase your abdominal pressure, your pressure inside your abdomen. You do that during defecation with your abdominal muscles, okay? Now, one of the problems with do that, if you increase the pressure inside your abdomen too much, that's going to prevent blood from returning back up to the heart. So sometimes when people are having a hard time defecating, occasionally one of them will faint. And that's because of the increased pressure inside their abdominal cavity. That prevents blood from returning to the heart. If you don't get as much blood returning to the heart, then the heart doesn't pump as much blood out. If it doesn't pump as much blood out, then blood pressure is going to fall because cardiac output will fall. Okay. So that kind of explains why that happens. All right. Now, the third mechanism, which really was the most recently described mechanism. 10 years ago, this was not even described in your textbook, although it was probably still happening. It's probably always been happening, just never was realized by physiologists. This third one is called cardiac suction. This is similar to what happens during inspiration in your thoracic cavity. It's a result of a drop in pressure in your heart. So during diastole, the ventricles of your heart start relaxing and the volume of the ventricles increases. When the volume of the ventricles decreases, that causes a drop in pressure. That drop in pressure not only causes blood to flow passively from the atria down into the ventricles, but that blood flow down to the ventricles also causes a drop in pressure, which helps to return blood to the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava. Okay? So that pumping of the heart during diastole actually creates a drop in pressure, which creates a suction. That suction helps to draw blood back to the heart. So that's another mechanism. So that's a mechanism that, unless you go into cardiac arrest, it's going to happen all the time. Okay? So that's how a person can stand completely still, not contract any of your leg muscles, and still not faint. Okay? Because you've got that. Because you always have to breathe unless you hold your breath. You probably don't want to do that for too long. You can't hold your breath for too long. But you're always going to have that respiratory pump occurring as long as you keep breathing, and you're always going to have this cardiac suction because your heart is always pumping as well. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. So let's just summarize what we've learned in this chapter. So in the second part of the chapter where we talked about blood pressure, we learned that mean arterial pressure is affected by cardiac output and peripheral resistance. So those are the two factors that determine mean arterial pressure, which is the average blood pressure over the cardiac cycle. We learned that blood flow can be affected by local autoregulation. That's a buildup of waste products that cause vasodilation, which increases blood flow to tissues. Also, neural control via the baroreceptor reflex and the chemo reflexes, and also by hormonal control. The hormonal control involves regulation of blood volume, and that's affected by hormones like aldosterone and natriuretic hormones that regulate blood volume. In fact, it regulates total body water, really, and in doing so, it regulates blood volume. Okay. And the higher your blood volume, the higher your blood pressure. So that's kind of a slower, long-term method of regulating blood pressure. The neural mechanisms and local autoregulation, those are the fastest mechanisms that help to regulate blood pressure. Venous return, therefore cardiac output and blood pressure, can be increased by the skeletal muscle pump, the respiratory pump, and also cardiac suction. So I do have a few review questions for you here before I'll take questions over any of the study questions. Okay, one of the things that you need to know backwards and forwards is the flow of blood through the heart. Starting with return of blood to the right atrium and ending with the blood being pumped out through the aorta to distribute blood to the body. So this is a question relating to the flow of blood through the heart. So it says immediately before entering the left ventricle, blood has to pass through which valve? Okay, this has to do with that little flow chart I had you do. Okay, I can guarantee you there'll be questions about that on this test. I wouldn't have had you do that if I didn't think that was important to know. Okay, so what's the name of the valve that blood would pass through immediately before entering the left ventricle? This should be a really easy question after you have, and by the way, I believe I've graded all of those assignments, that active learning exercise. So make sure you look at the comments I made. Most of you did it correctly. In fact, most of you did not make any mistakes at all. There were some errors of omission though. There was a few people, just a handful of people, who left out one or more of the vowels. That was about the only problem I saw in there. Otherwise, it was pretty good. Okay, I think we have everybody answered here if I counted correctly. Most of you said left AV valve, and that is correct. Okay, blood goes from the left atrium through the left AV valve, which is also known as a bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. And then from there, it's pumped through the aortic valve and then into the aorta, which distributes blood to the body. Okay, this is a question that has to do with regulation of cardiac output, which in turn affects blood pressure. Okay. It says in response to elevated carbon dioxide levels, heart rate does what? I'll give you a hint on this. This has to do with the chemoreflexes that mainly regulate breathing, which is the next organ system we're going to go to after we get done with the heart. I think let me think. Well, we're going to go through a chapter on the lymphatic system, then we're going to go on to the respiratory system. So we'll be doing that before the third exam. One more person needs to answer. Okay, last call. All right, let's take a look. Most of you said increase, and that's correct, because in the aortic arch and in the carotid sinuses, there are chemoreceptors. And those chemoreceptors are responsive mainly to changes in pH and levels of CO2. Now, as it turns out, the primary factor that affects pH is the levels of CO2. Because as we'll see later, CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, and it gives off hydrogen ions. So carbon dioxide levels and pH are somewhat correlated. So when CO2 levels increase, that stimulates the chemoreceptors, and the primary effect of that is to increase the breathing rate. But there are also inputs from the chemoreceptors to the cardiac center, and that the cardiac center responds by increasing sympathetic stimulation, which increases the rate of the heart. So that is going to cause the heart rate to increase. Okay. Next question has to do with the baroreceptor reflex. This has to do with the pathway that so the question says, signals from the baroreceptors are carried by cranial nerves 9 and 10, which are the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve, to what part of the brain? So there's where's the vasomotor center in the brain? Vasomotor center is what controls blood pressure. question would have been, what nerves carry the signals from the baroreceptors? That'd be a harder question. But here what I'm asking for is, I'm asking for the location of the control center for the baroreceptor reflex. Okay. And so let's take a look at the results. Most of you said medulla oblongata, and that's correct. That's where the part of the medulla oblongata that regulates blood pressure is called the vasomotor center. Okay. That used to be thought to be part of the cardiac center, but now they have separated the two out. Okay, so this is the question I just was referring to. Okay, what's the name of the nerve that carries signals from the baroreceptor in the carotid sinuses? You know, I think I may have, I hate to admit this, but I think I made a mistake earlier this week when I told you which nerves carry the signals from the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses. I think I got those two nerves switched around. I had the right nerves, I just got them switched around. I don't know if any of you caught that or not. But this is really not all that important. The important thing is to know there is a pathway that travels from the baroreceptors to the vasomotor center. Let's take a look at the results so far. There's almost an even tie between the vagus and glossopharyngeal. It is one of the two, okay, but the correct answer is glossopharyngeal. I do think I got those two mixed up the other day, but that's not really too terribly important. As long as you remember that those signals are carried by two of the cranial nerves, that's probably the most important thing. Okay, that's the end then of chapter 20. So I did bring a copy of the study questions that I have on Canvas. Like I said, I think the most important thing to know, really, there's probably going to be quite a few questions about the flow of blood through the heart. And you really need to know that both forwards and backwards. Okay, so you really need to know it well, because I could ask a question such as, if the tricuspid valve were to leak during diastole, what chamber would blood go into from the right ventricle? So you have to know the opposite direction then. So if you know the forward direction, you should be able to figure out what the opposite direction was. So if your tricuspid valve leaked during systole, what chamber would blood enter? Into the right atrium, right. Right, it'd go into the right atrium. It would leak backwards into the right atrium. During systole, but not during diastole. During diastole, blood would be flowing into the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So that's what's called a heart murmur. A heart murmur is one of those valves leaks and blood goes the wrong direction. That's going to compromise cardiac output. Another kind of question you should be prepared to answer. You need to know the pressure changes that cause the valves to open and close. Okay, when the pressure in the ventricles drops below the pressure in the atria, then blood is going to flow from the atrium to the ventricles, because blood, just like air, always goes from an area higher pressure to lower pressure. Same thing in simple diffusion. Substances diffuse from an area higher concentration to lower concentration. Okay. When when the ventricles start contracting and pressure increases above that of the atria, then the AV valves close, and blood is ejected through the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay. So you need to know the pressure changes that result in the opening and closing valves. And the other thing that those pressure changes do is it allows blood to flow through the circulatory system. Okay. So you need to know the pressure changes that are associated with all of those phases of the cardiac cycle, okay, of which there were, I think there are 5. There's isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. Then there's, let's see, there's passive filling. There's also diastasis, and then there's atrial systole. Then after that, you have isovolumetric ventricular contraction phase. It's when all 4 valves are closed again. And then you have ventricular ejection during systole. So you need to know what the valves are doing at each one of those stages and what the pressure changes are doing. Those pressure changes is what causes the blood to flow through the heart and to be ejected through the heart. So I want you to, I don't want you just understanding the flow of blood through the heart, but I want you to know why. Why does it flow? Well, it flows because of pressure changes. Same thing in blood vessels. Blood flows through the blood vessels because of 2 things. The pressure difference between 2 points and also the peripheral resistance. Those are the 2 factors that affect blood flow. And then there are 2 mathematical relationships that's important to remember. Cardiac output is determined by heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, and then mean arterial pressure is determined by cardiac output times peripheral resistance. Also, you can calculate mean arterial pressure, so there's a 3rd equation. You can determine mean arterial pressure by taking the pulse, by taking the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. Okay. So, I could ask more than one question for each one of these relationships. Another important concept is the Frank-Starling law of the heart. There's a direct relationship between end diastolic volume and stroke volume. So the more the heart fills with blood, the more the heart pumps. Or in other words, the greater the end diastolic volume, the greater the stroke volume. And then know why that occurs. Okay. The reason is the more blood that fills the ventricles, the more the ventricles are stretched. The more the ventricles are stretched, the more calcium goes into the muscle fibers during the cardiac action potential. And the more calcium you have in those cardiac muscle fibers, the stronger the contraction. So more stretching causes more calcium to enter the cells. More calcium means more cross-bridge cycling and stronger contraction. It used to be, when I took physiology as an undergraduate, the explanation was, well, when the heart stretches, the sarcomeres are stretched to more optimal length. Physiologists have now rejected that, and then they now explain it in terms of calcium, which in a way almost makes more sense. Okay. Any other questions? Those are just a few highlights that I can think of that you might want to focus on studying. So our exam is Monday.